I'm Tori, 28 years old. For as long as I can recall, my father insisted I was far too beautiful to be his true daughter. He claimed my blonde hair and blue eyes were clear evidence of my mother's infidelity. He accused her of cheating and treated me as living proof of a betrayal she never committed. When he finally demanded a DNA test before he'd walk me down the aisle, I reluctantly agreed. Yet the results didn't merely disprove his suspicions of an affair, they revealed I was neither his daughter nor my mother's. What we uncovered at the hospital where I was born brought my father to his knees before 60 stunned relatives. Before we continue, if you appreciate tales of hidden truths and family revelations, please take a second to like and subscribe, but only if this story truly speaks to you. Share your location and local time in the comments. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Now, let me transport you back 6 weeks to the evening my father delivered his ultimatum. It was Sunday dinner at my parents' home in Fairfield, Connecticut, a handsome 6-bedroom Tudor-style house my father never tired of reminding us he'd built through his own hard work. The dining room shone with restoration hardware pieces and Wedgwood china that my mother polished weekly, as though flawless presentation might shield her from his endless accusations. My grandmother, Eleanor, sat at the table's far end, silver hair neatly pinned, observing my father with the sharp focus of a hawk tracking a serpent. My brother Marcus, 31, and the undisputed golden child, stared fixedly at his plate. My mother, Diane, gripped her linen napkin like a lifeline. Then Gerald Townsend cleared his throat. "I won't be attending your wedding, Tori." The statement exploded like a grenade. My mother's fork struck her plate with a clatter. "Gerald," she whispered, "please, not tonight." But he was already reaching into his jacket. He withdrew a folded document and slid it across the oak table toward me. "I've considered this for a long time," he said, his tone calm and almost practiced. "I refuse to walk another man's daughter down the aisle, not until we resolve this definitively." I examined the paper, a consent form for a paternity DNA test from a nearby clinic, his signature already in place at the bottom. "You have 6 weeks," Gerald continued. "Take the test, share the results with the entire family. If you're mine, I'll be there, and I'll even apologize." He offered a smile that never touched his eyes. "But we both know what it will reveal." My grandmother's teacup struck the saucer with a crisp snap. Silent tears traced down my mother's face, and I sat staring at my father's Rolex Submariner sparkling beneath the chandelier, thinking, 28 years. He's been constructing this moment for 28 years. I didn't sign the form that night. I didn't storm out. I simply replied, "Thank you for the reminder, Gerald. I'll remember this." And I meant it deeply. I should clarify why that dinner felt so unsurprising. By 28, I'd come to recognize my father's cruelty as a predictable pattern, steady as the tide, yet twice as unyielding. At 7, I first grasped I was different. I'd pressed my ear to my parents' bedroom door after hearing my mother sob and caught him snarling, "Look at that blonde hair. Where did it come from, Diane? Certainly not from me." At 12, I longed to join the school volleyball team. Gerald refused to sign the permission slip. "I'm not investing in someone else's child," he declared in front of Marcus, who received fresh baseball cleats that same week. At 18, Marcus headed to Boston University. Gerald covered every expense: tuition, housing, meals, pocket money. When I was accepted to nursing school, he looked across that same dining table and said, "Your real father can pay for yours." So I took loans, worked double shifts at a diner, and graduated 6 years later with $60,000 in debt and a degree earned entirely on my own. The deepest pain wasn't financial or lost chances. It was witnessing the toll his accusations took on my mother. Every dispute, no matter the topic, bills, vacations, Marcus's future, somehow circled back to me. I became his weapon, his proof, his perpetual symbol of her supposed betrayal. The night before I left for college, my grandmother Eleanor drew me aside. Keep every document from the hospital where you were born, she instructed, her grasp firm on my wrist. Your birth certificate, all paperwork. I sense we'll need them one day. I didn't comprehend then, but I preserved those papers, and 18 years later, I would finally understand why. That evening, I drove back to my modest one-bedroom apartment in Hartford, furnished with thrift store finds and sheer determination. Nathan waited on the couch, laptop open to client floor plans, 2 glasses of wine poured. He sensed trouble instantly. What did he do this time? I recounted the DNA form, the ultimatum, the 6-week deadline. Nathan's jaw clenched with each detail. Maybe you should just do it, he said at last. Take the test, prove him wrong once and for all, silence him forever. I set down my wine glass, a simple Target find, nothing like the Waterford crystal my father favored, and gazed at the modest diamond on my finger. Nathan had crafted the ring himself, following a sketch I'd drawn years earlier in a journal. It's no longer about proving him wrong, I said. It's about liberating my mother. Nathan fell silent. He knew the story I was going to share. 5 years ago, my grandmother called me at 2 a.m. She discovered my mother in the bathroom clutching an empty bottle of sleeping pills. Paramedics arrived just in time. Since then, Diane had relied on antidepressants, therapy twice weekly, slowly piecing herself together. Gerald never apologized. He never acknowledged the devastation of 23 years of accusations. He simply persisted in claiming he was right. My mother gave that man 35 years of unwavering loyalty and devotion. I told Nathan she had been completely faithful, yet he repaid her with 28 years of branding her a liar. I lifted my phone and opened the website of a local genetics lab I'd researched months before, independent, certified, and crucially unconnected to Gerald. I'll take the test, but I'll handle it on my terms. 2 weeks later, Gerald turned 60. The celebration took place at the Fairfield Country Club, 18 pristine holes overlooking Long Island Sound, a private dining room framed by floor-to-ceiling windows, and 30 relatives assembled to honor the man who had turned my mother's life into a cage. I wore a simple black dress. Nathan gripped my hand as we entered, murmuring, 2 hours. We can endure 2 hours. We barely managed. Midway through dinner, after 3 glasses of Chateau Margaux, Gerald rose to speak. He thanked everyone for attending. He commended Marcus for his stellar career in finance. He toasted my mother for her enduring patience. Then his gaze settled on me. I see my daughter is here tonight, he said, the word daughter laced with invisible quotation marks. A few relatives offered uneasy chuckles. I hope she's given thought to our discussion about proving where she truly comes from. The room fell silent. Dad, Marcus said, half rising, maybe this isn't the moment. Gerald brushed him aside. No, this is precisely the moment. Family deserves honesty. He smiled at me, that familiar, cold, reptilian smile I'd witnessed countless times. You know what they call a bird that lays its eggs in another bird's nest? A cuckoo. The cuckoo's egg may look lovely, doesn't it? But it doesn't belong. It never did. Somewhere behind me, an aunt gasped. A cousin stifled a laugh. My mother stared at her lap, tears falling onto her Cartier bracelet, a remorse gift Gerald had presented after one of their fiercest arguments. I lifted my fork, set it down, and stood, every eye in the room fixed on me. Thank you for the reminder, Gerald, I said, my voice calm and even. I'll remember this. Then I turned to my mother. Mom, would you like to step outside for some fresh air? She took my hand. Together we walked out, past the murmurs, past the stares, past the man who had spent 28 years trying to break us both. But I was far from finished. My grandmother caught up with us in the parking lot, her heels striking the asphalt like sharp reports. Tori, wait! I turned. Eleanor Whitmore, 78, stood with regal posture and eyes that overlooked nothing. She had never trusted Gerald. She'd once told my mother before the wedding, that man thinks he's God's gift to engineering, but he's merely a small man with an oversized ego. Now she looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, urgency.
"There's something I need to tell you," she said, glancing back to ensure Gerald hadn't followed. "Something I should have shared years ago." She guided us to a bench facing the golf course. The sun dipped low, brushing the sky in warm orange and rose, and her voice fell to a near whisper. "The night you were born, something peculiar occurred at St. Mary's Hospital." I felt my mother tense beside me. "When the nurse brought you out to show your grandfather, he was still alive then, and we were both there, she looked frightened. Her hands trembled. She passed you to Diane too hastily, then hurried from the room." "Mom," Diane said, voice breaking, "you never told me any of this." I tried to look into it. I phoned the hospital, asked questions. They blocked me at every turn, insisted everything was routine, all records sealed for privacy. Eleanor reached into her purse and withdrew a faded sheet of paper. "But I made a copy of your birth record before they sealed everything away." I studied the document. Time of birth, 11:47 p.m. "I gave birth at 11:58, my mother said slowly. "I remember glancing at the clock. The doctor even joked about almost having a leap day baby." 11 minutes. Something had transpired in those 11 minutes. "There's a name," my grandmother continued. "The head nurse that night, Margaret Sullivan. She retired 10 years ago. I have her address." The next morning, I entered Gene Trust's Hartford office carrying 3 DNA samples. Mine was straightforward, a cheek swab in a sterile vial. My mother's was given willingly. The night before, eyes glistening but hands steady, she'd said, "Whatever this reveals, you are my daughter. That never changes." My father's was taken without permission, several strands pulled from the brush he kept in the guest bathroom, the same brush I'd passed every Thanksgiving and Christmas for years, pretending not to notice how he recoiled when I reached nearby for soap. The technician, a composed woman named Dr. Reyes, outlined the procedure. Results in 3 weeks, legally admissible if required, total confidentiality. I paid the premium for rush processing. My grandmother insisted on covering the expense. That afternoon, I dialed Margaret Sullivan. The line rang 6 times before an older, slightly unsteady voice answered. "Hello, Mrs. Sullivan. My name is Tori Townsend. I was born at St. Mary's Hospital on March 15th, 1997. I believe you were the head nurse that night, and I can't help you." The words rushed out, edged with panic. "Mrs. Sullivan, please, I only need to ask. I don't know what you're referring to. Please don't call me again." Click. I stared at the phone for several seconds. Nathan glanced up from his drafting table. "What happened?" She hung up. I set the phone down carefully, but not before registering her fear. She knows something, Nathan. She definitely knows something. An innocent person would have sounded puzzled. Margaret Sullivan was terrified. Whatever took place that night in 1997, she had carried it for 28 years. And now, so would I. 3 days later, the email arrived. Not to me alone. Gerald lacked that subtlety. He sent it to the entire extended family. Aunts, uncles, cousins, second cousins, people I hadn't seen since childhood. 47 recipients. My mother, my grandmother, and I were all copied. The subject line read, "Regarding Tori's wedding." I opened it in my car, parked outside the hospital where I worked, hands shaking against the wheel. "Dear family, as many of you know, I have carried a burden for 28 years. I have lived with doubt about my daughter's true parentage, and I have watched my wife refuse to acknowledge the truth.
I'll take the test, but I'll do it my way. 2 weeks later, Gerald turned 60. The celebration unfolded at the Fairfield Country Club, 18 immaculate holes overlooking Long Island Sound, a private dining room framed by floor-to-ceiling windows, and 30 relatives gathered to honor the man who had made my mother's existence a confinement. I wore a simple black dress. Nathan held my hand as we entered, whispering, "2 hours. We can survive 2 hours." We scarcely did. Halfway through dinner, after 3 glasses of Chateau Margaux, Gerald rose to speak. He thanked everyone for coming. He lauded Marcus for his outstanding career in finance. He raised a glass to my mother for her steadfast patience. Then his gaze locked on me. I see my daughter is here tonight, he said, the word daughter heavy with unspoken quotation marks. A few relatives gave awkward chuckles. I hope she's reflected on our conversation about proving where she truly belongs. The room hushed. Dad, Marcus said, half standing, maybe this isn't the moment. Gerald dismissed him with a wave. No, this is exactly the moment. Families should be truthful with one another. He offered me that familiar, cold, serpentine smile I'd endured 1,000 times. You know what they call a bird that lays its eggs in another bird's nest? A cuckoo. The cuckoo's egg may appear beautiful, doesn't it? But it doesn't belong. It never did. Behind me, an aunt gasped. A cousin smothered a laugh. My mother stared into her lap, tears falling onto her Cartier bracelet, a remorseful gift Gerald had given after one of their most bitter quarrels. I lifted my fork, set it down again, and stood. Every eye turned to me. Thank you for the reminder, Gerald, I said, voice level and clear. I'll remember this. Then I turned to my mother. Mom, would you like to step outside for some air? She took my hand. We walked out together, past the murmurs, past the stares, past the man who had devoted 28 years to tearing us apart. But I was nowhere near finished. My grandmother caught up in the parking lot, heels clicking sharply against the asphalt like distant gunfire. Tori, wait. I turned. Eleanor Whitmore, 78, stood with the poise of royalty and eyes that missed nothing. She had never warmed to Gerald. That man thinks he's God's gift to engineering, she'd once told my mother before the wedding, but he's only a small man with an oversized ego. Now she looked at me with an intensity I'd never seen. Urgency. There's something I need to tell you, she said, glancing back to confirm Gerald hadn't followed. Something I should have told you long ago. She led us to a bench overlooking the golf course. The sun sank, streaking the sky in soft orange and rose, and her voice dropped to a hushed murmur. The night you were born, something odd happened at St. Mary's Hospital. I felt my mother stiffen beside me. When the nurse brought you out to show your grandfather, he was still alive then and we were both present, she looked frightened. Her hands shook. She handed you to Diane too quickly, then almost fled the room. Mom, Diane said, voice fracturing, you never mentioned any of this. I tried to investigate. I called the hospital, asked questions. They blocked me completely, insisted everything was normal, all records sealed for privacy. Eleanor reached into her purse and drew out a yellowed sheet. But I made a copy of your birth record before they locked everything away. I examined the document. Time of birth, 11:47 p.m. I gave birth at 11:58, my mother said slowly. I remember glancing at the clock. The doctor even teased about almost having a leap day baby. 11 minutes. Something occurred in those 11 minutes. There's a name, my grandmother continued, the head nurse that night, Margaret Sullivan. She retired 10 years ago. I have her address. The next morning, I entered Gene Trust's Hartford office with 3 DNA samples. Mine was simple, a cheek swab in a sterile tube. My mother's was given freely. The night before, eyes shining but hands steady, she said, "Whatever this shows, you are my daughter. Nothing changes that." My father's was taken without consent, several strands lifted from the brush he kept in the guest bathroom, the same brush I'd passed every Thanksgiving and Christmas for years, pretending not to notice how he recoiled when I reached nearby for soap. The technician, a composed woman named Dr. Reyes, described the process. Results in 3 weeks, legally admissible if required, complete confidentiality. I paid extra for expedited service. My grandmother insisted on covering the cost. That afternoon, I phoned Margaret Sullivan. The line rang 6 times before an older, faintly trembling voice answered. "Hello, Mrs. Sullivan. My name is Tori Townsend. I was born at St. Mary's Hospital on March 15th, 1997. I believe you were the head nurse that night, and I can't help you." The reply came swift and panicked. "Mrs. Sullivan, please, I only need to ask. I don't know what you're talking about. Please don't contact me again." Click. I stared at the phone for a long moment. Nathan looked up from his drafting table. "What happened?"
She hung up. I set the phone down carefully, but not before registering her terror. She knows something, Nathan. She definitely knows something. An innocent person would have sounded bewildered. Margaret Sullivan was frightened. Whatever happened that night in 1997, she had carried it for 28 years, and now so would I. 3 days later, the email arrived, not addressed to me alone. Gerald was never that discreet. He sent it to the entire extended family. Aunts, uncles, cousins, second cousins, people I hadn't seen since childhood. 47 recipients. My mother, my grandmother, and I were all copied. The subject line read, "Regarding Tori's wedding." I read it in my car, parked outside the hospital where I worked, hands trembling on the steering wheel. "Dear family, I have asked Tori to take a DNA test and share the results with our family before her wedding. She has so far refused, which I believe speaks for itself. Until this matter is resolved, your mother lied to me for nearly 3 decades, and now the world will finally see the true nature of Diane Townsend." He ended the call before I could respond, before I could explain that Diane hadn't lied, that she had spoken the truth all along, that the reality was something far beyond anything any of us had ever imagined. Within the hour, Gerald phoned my mother and issued his ultimatum. "Pack your bags. I want you out of my house by the end of the month. I'm finished with your deception." My grandmother drove straight over and stayed with her. When I arrived that evening, I found them both in the living room. My mother curled on the couch like something broken, my grandmother standing watch like a silver-haired guardian. "He thinks he's won," I said softly. My grandmother met my gaze with those piercing, perceptive eyes. "Then let's reveal the rest of the truth." The following 3 days were the most exhausting of my life. I considered calling off the wedding, not because of Gerald, but because I couldn't imagine my mother's long-awaited vindication being eclipsed by white lace and champagne toasts. Nathan refused to entertain the idea. "We're getting married," he said, cradling my face in his hands. "End of discussion. Your father's chaos is not our chaos. We don't delay our future for his outburst." Still, I couldn't move forward without answers, and those answers rested in Margaret Sullivan's long-guarded memory. I dialed her repeatedly, 5 times over 3 days, each call dropping straight to voicemail. On the 6th attempt, I left a different message. "Mrs. Sullivan, my name is Tori Townsend. I know that name means something to you. I have certified, legally admissible DNA evidence proving a baby was switched at St. Mary's Hospital on March 15, 1997. I'm not here to assign blame. I'm not here to sue. I simply need to know who I really am." I paused, steadying my voice. "If you don't return my call, my next step will be a lawyer. I'll subpoena the hospital records. I'll initiate a formal investigation. Whatever you've kept hidden for 28 years will surface in the most painful way possible." I waited 1 hour, then 2. At 4:17 p.m., my phone vibrated with a text from an unknown number. "Thursday, 2 p.m., Riverside Diner, Bridgeport. Come alone." I stared at the words for a long moment. Then I replied, "I'll be there." Whatever burden Margaret Sullivan had shouldered for 28 years, she was finally prepared to release it. The only question was whether I was prepared to receive it. Riverside Diner felt like a relic time had overlooked. Vinyl booths mended with duct tape, a jukebox devoted to vintage hits, coffee that might have been brewing since the Reagan years. Margaret Sullivan occupied the corner booth, back to the wall. She was 72, smaller than I'd pictured, silver hair drawn into a severe bun, hands unsteady around her coffee mug. She looked up as I slid into the seat opposite her. "You look just like her," she murmured. "Linda, your biological mother, the same hair, the same eyes." My heart faltered. "You know who my biological mother is?" Margaret closed her eyes for a long breath. When she opened them, they glistened. I've carried this for 28 years, she said, every single day, questioning whether silence was the right choice, wondering if I should have spoken when it first happened. She reached into her purse and withdrew a weathered leather journal, its pages brittle with age. This is my shift log from March 15th, 1997, the night you were born. She opened to a marked page and pushed it across the table. I read her tight handwriting, ice spreading through my veins with every word. 11:47 p.m., baby girl number 1, born to Diane Townsend, healthy, 7 pounds, 2 ounces. 12:58 p.m., baby girl number 2, born to Linda Morrison, healthy, 6 pounds, 4 ounces. 12:32 a.m., incident. Trainee nurse Carla Harris mixed up infants after bathing. Error discovered at 2:15 a.m., both families already bonded. 2:45 a.m., meeting with hospital administrator. Decision, correct records, not families. Less traumatic overall. NDA required for all staff present. I lifted my gaze to Margaret, hands trembling. They knew, I whispered. They knew that very night, and they covered it up. The administrator insisted switching you back would cause greater harm, she said, voice fracturing. Both mothers had already held their infants, fed them, named them. She was only 24 at the time. They threatened her license, her future pension. They required her to sign a non-disclosure agreement. She had 2 young children to support. Who was the other baby, the one who went home with Linda Morrison? Margaret drew another sheet from her purse, a printed screenshot of a social media profile. A woman my age, chestnut brown hair, warm brown eyes, a smile that mirrored Marcus's exactly. Her name is Rachel Morrison. She's 28. She lives in Springfield, Massachusetts. She looked at me, guilt etched deep into every line of her face. And she is your mother's biological daughter. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, laptop open to Rachel Morrison's LinkedIn profile. Elementary school teacher at Springfield Public Schools, UMass Amherst graduate, volunteer at the local animal shelter. Her profile photo showed a woman with rich brown hair and kind brown eyes, standing before a classroom bright with alphabet banners and children's artwork. She looked precisely like what my brother Marcus might have been if born female. I drafted the message 17 times before I finally pressed send. Hi, Rachel. This is going to sound completely unbelievable, and I'm sorry in advance. My name is Tori Townsend. I was born at St. Mary's Hospital in Bridgeport, Connecticut on March 15, 1997. I recently took a DNA test that proved I'm not biologically related to either my parents. I've spoken with a nurse who worked that night, and she confirmed that 2 babies were accidentally switched that night. I believe you are the biological daughter of Diane and Gerald Townsend, and I believe I am the biological daughter of Linda Morrison. I have documentation. I have a witness statement. I'm not asking for anything from you. I simply need to know who I really am. I know this is a lot to take in. If you're open to talking, please call me. I included my number, closed the laptop before doubt could overtake me, and waited. 24 hours passed. I checked my phone obsessively every 10 minutes, like a teenager awaiting a reply from a long crushed crush. Then, at 9:38 p.m. the following night, it rang. Is this Tori? The voice on the line trembled, hesitant, uncertain, yet carried an inexplicable familiarity. Rachel. A long silence followed, broken by a shaky inhale. My whole life, people have said I don't look like my parents. My dad, my legal dad, used to tease that maybe the hospital mixed us up. We all laughed it off. She made a sound that hovered between a laugh and a sob. I guess it wasn't a joke after all.
We spoke for 3 hours that night. By the end, we had both agreed to another DNA test, this one comparing Rachel directly to Gerald and Diane. Results would arrive in 10 days, perfectly timed for my engagement party. Over the next week, I assembled my evidence with the precision of a prosecutor readying for trial. First, the documents. My original gene trust report confirming 0% match with both Gerald and Diane. Margaret Sullivan's handwritten shift log from 1997, which she had finally permitted me to photograph, and a notarized affidavit from Margaret, executed before a witness at her attorney's office. Her own choice, she explained, to unburden her conscience at last. The hospital held that thread over me for 28 years, she said when I collected the document. I'm 72 now. What are they going to do, fire me from retirement? Second, the DNA. Rachel had submitted her samples to Gene Trust via the same expedited service I'd used. Her comparison results to Gerald and Diane would land 2 days before the party. Third, the witnesses. My grandmother, Eleanor, would be present. She had waited 28 years for this reckoning. Margaret Sullivan agreed to attend, seated discreetly in the corner until called upon. And Rachel, my biological sister in every sense except genetics, would wait in the adjoining room. Are you certain about this? Nathan asked as we finalized the plan, the public confrontation. There's no undoing it once it begins. I thought of my mother, of the empty pill bottle, of 28 years spent branded a liar, a cheater. He demanded a public spectacle, I replied. He sent that email to 47 people. He called me a cuckoo's egg in front of the entire family. I aligned the stack of documents neatly on my desk. He doesn't get to retreat quietly now. Everyone who believed him deserves to witness the truth. Nathan nodded slowly. Then let's deliver a performance they'll never forget. 3 days before the engagement party, Rachel's results arrived. Subject A, Rachel Morrison, shows 99.97% genetic match with Subject B, Gerald Townsend. Subject A, Rachel Morrison, shows 99.98% genetic match with Subject C, Diane Townsend. I read the figures 3 times through streaming tears. Then I called Rachel. Can you meet me tomorrow in person? We selected a Starbucks halfway between Hartford and Springfield, neutral territory for 2 women whose lives had just been rewritten by laboratory precision. She was already seated at a corner table when I arrived, 2 untouched lattes before her. When our eyes met, she rose so quickly her chair nearly overturned. For several heartbeats, we simply stared. She had rich brown hair, warm brown eyes, a firm jawline I'd seen mirrored in Marcus countless times, and a faint dimple on her left cheek, the very one Gerald carried. And I had blonde hair, blue eyes, a small button nose, and fair skin that echoed the photographs Margaret had shown me of Linda Morrison. We were strangers who should have been sisters raised by the wrong families. This is so strange, Rachel whispered. Then she laughed. I laughed, and suddenly we were embracing in the middle of a crowded Starbucks, tears soaking each other's shoulders while baristas politely averted their eyes. I want to meet them, Gerald and Diane, my biological parents. You will, I promised, in 3 days. I didn't mention that one of those parents would likely be on his knees when she entered the room. The engagement party took place at Whittemore Estate, my grandmother's ancestral home, a graceful Georgian manor surrounded by rose gardens and fairy lights woven through ancient oaks. She had insisted on hosting to ensure a genuine celebration in a space untouched by Gerald's influence. 60 guests arrived that evening in cocktail attire. Aunts, uncles, cousins, friends, and every recipient of Gerald's condemning email. I wore a navy blue Reformation dress and carried myself with the quiet certainty of someone who had already prevailed. Nathan remained close, his hand resting gently at the small of my back, steady as ever. My mother arrived alongside my grandmother, eyes still rimmed red from days of weeping, yet her carriage straighter than I had seen in years.
A profound shift had occurred within her since the truth emerged, a burden beginning to lift even before the public exoneration. And then Gerald arrived. Late, naturally, fashionably late, as he would frame it, allowing the crowd to swell, the tension to thicken. He wore a Tom Ford suit, Rolex glinting beneath chandelier light, a self-satisfied smirk tugging at his lips. He believed this was his moment of triumph. He had no idea. I watched him circulate, shaking hands, accepting sympathetic murmurs from relatives who had swallowed his narrative. "Such a difficult situation," an aunt whispered to him. "You've been remarkably patient." Marcus stood at his side, uneasy but obedient, the ever-faithful lieutenant. In the corner, Margaret Sullivan sat quietly with a glass of water, hands still faintly trembling after all these decades. And in the adjoining room, connected by a discreet door to the main hall, Rachel Morrison waited for her signal. I checked my phone. Nathan gave a subtle nod. It was time. Halfway through cocktail hour, Gerald requested a microphone. The room hushed as he stepped onto the small raised platform my grandmother had arranged for toasts. He cleared his jacket, smoothed his jacket, and smiled at the assembly like a monarch addressing his court. "First, I'd like to congratulate Nathan. You're a courageous man marrying into such a complicated family." A scattering of nervous chuckles moved through the guests. "But I think we all understand why I'm standing here truly." His eyes located me in the crowd, and a flicker of ice passed through them.
There's been endless speculation lately, endless whispers. I asked Tori to take a DNA test, and I know she complied. What I cannot fathom is why she has concealed the results. The room fell into absolute silence. So I decided to assist her. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded sheet of paper. My son was gracious enough to provide me with a copy of the report. Marcus, at least, had the grace to appear ashamed. Gerald unfolded the document with deliberate drama. 0% genetic match with Gerald Townsend, 0% genetic match with Diane Townsend. Gasps rippled through the crowd. My mother clutched Eleanor's hand. 28 years, Gerald declared, his voice swelling with righteous fury. 28 years I've insisted something was wrong, and now science has confirmed it. He turned to my mother, face twisted with decades of pent-up bitterness. "You lied to me, Diane. You lied to every single person here. And now the entire family understands precisely what kind of woman you truly are." The silence that followed was suffocating. Then I began walking toward the platform. "You're absolutely right, Gerald." My voice remained steady as I stepped onto the stage and gently took the microphone from his grasp. He was so stunned he released it without resistance. "The DNA test proves I am not your biological daughter, and I am not Mom's biological daughter either." Gerald's smirk broadened for a fleeting second. A few relatives exchanged smug glances until they weren't. "Not because Mom had an affair." The smirk wavered. I turned to face the 60 guests, every person who had received that vicious email, every relative who had murmured accusations against my mother for years. "Allow me to introduce someone." I nodded toward the side door. Rachel stepped into the room, 28 years old, chestnut brown hair, warm brown eyes, a jawline unmistakably, irrefutably Townsend. The room exploded in murmurs. A champagne flute shattered on the floor. Marcus made a choked sound deep in his throat. "This is Rachel Morrison," I said clearly. "She was born 11 minutes before me at St. Mary's Hospital on March 15, 1997. The night I was born, a trainee nurse accidentally switched two infants after bathing them. The hospital concealed the error to avoid litigation." I tapped my phone. The wall-mounted screen I had prepared earlier illuminated, displaying the Gene Trust reports side by side.
Rachel's DNA shows a 99.97% match with Gerald Townsend and a 99.98% match with Diane Townsend. I let the numbers settle over the room like dust after an explosion. She is your biological daughter, Gerald, the daughter you claim to have been searching for her entire life. She has lived in Massachusetts all these years because a hospital committed an error and chose to bury it. Gerald's face drained of color. He stared at Rachel, really looked at her, and I watched 28 years of unshakable conviction fracture before my eyes. This is Margaret Sullivan, I continued, as Margaret rose from her quiet corner seat. She was the head nurse on duty that night. She has provided a notarized affidavit confirming every detail, the shift log, the hospital cover-up, everything. Margaret stepped forward, voice unsteady but resolute. Mr. Townsend, I was present. I witnessed it unfold. Your wife never betrayed you. Never. The hospital forced us to sign non-disclosure agreements. They threatened our licenses, our livelihoods. I am profoundly sorry I remained silent for so long. I turned back to Gerald, whose fingers now clutched the platform edge as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. You demanded science, Gerald. Here it is. Every document, every signature, every one of those 11 minutes that forever altered two families. In that instant, standing on the stage with Rachel at my side, I experienced something absent from my life for 28 years. Vindication. Not merely for myself, but for my mother, for every tear she had shed in secret, every insult she had endured, every sleepless night spent questioning whether her husband would ever believe her innocence. If this story is touching you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes truth lies buried for decades before it finally breaks through. Now, let me tell you what happened when Gerald finally grasped the magnitude of what he had done. Gerald Townsend had spent 28 years utterly convinced his wife had betrayed him, convinced his daughter was living proof of that betrayal, convinced his suspicion was justified, his harshness righteous, his eventual vindication inevitable. Now, science had spoken, and it had demolished every pillar he had constructed his identity upon. He stared at Rachel, this stranger who carried his jawline, his dimple, his blood, and something inside him irrevocably broke. He stared at the DNA results glowing on the screen, numbers that confirmed he was right about my parentage, yet catastrophically wrong about everything else. He stared at Margaret Sullivan, whose trembling but unwavering testimony had just dismantled 28 years of relentless accusations. Then his knees gave way. Gerald Townsend, proud, arrogant, unassailable Gerald Townsend, crumpled onto the platform like a marionette severed from its strings. He caught himself on one knee, palms slapping against the polished wood, chest rising and falling in ragged gasps. I didn't know. How could I have known? How? You could have trusted her. My voice was soft, but carried clearly through the hushed room. You could have searched for answers. You could have... Now the truth blazed across every screen, every document, and in the face of a stranger who carried her very blood. Diane stepped forward slowly, heels clicking against the polished hardwood like measured heartbeats. The crowd parted instinctively. Even Marcus stepped aside without a word. She stopped before Gerald, who remained on one knee, face streaked with tears I had never once witnessed in all my 28 years. 28 years, Gerald. Her voice rang clear and strong, stronger than I had ever heard it. 28 years. I stayed because I loved you, because I believed that one day you would trust me, because I thought our family was worth every battle. Gerald lifted his gaze to her. Diane, She raised her hand, silencing him. Not yet. You don't get to apologize yet. The room held its collective breath. You owe me an apology in front of every single person who received that email.
You owe Tori an apology for every birthday you overshadowed, every graduation you dismissed, every moment you made her feel like an intruder in her own home." She gestured toward Rachel, who stood motionless near the doorway. "And you owe Rachel an apology for being the father she deserved but never had the chance to know." Gerald's shoulders convulsed with sobs I hadn't believed him capable of producing. "I didn't need the world to believe me, Gerald." My mother's voice fractured on the final word. "I needed you to believe me, and you never did." She turned away from him and crossed to where Rachel waited. "Hello," she said softly, tears tracing silver paths down her cheeks. "I'm your mother. I'm so sorry it took so long to find you." It took Gerald 3 attempts to rise. Marcus offered no hand. Neither did I. No one in that room, full of relatives who mere minutes earlier had accepted his narrative, moved to assist him. He gripped the platform edge, hauled himself upright, and reached for the microphone I had set aside. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse, broken, stripped of every trace of the arrogance that had defined him my entire life. "I was wrong. 3 words, 28 years overdue. I was wrong about Diane. She never—" His voice cracked. He swallowed and tried in. "She never betrayed me. I accused her for nearly 3 decades, and I was wrong." He looked at me, and for the first time in my memory, I saw something besides suspicion in his eyes. "Tori, I took things from you that I can never return. Your childhood, your trust, money that should have been yours." He swallowed hard. "I'll repay your student loans, all of them. It isn't enough, but it's a beginning." Then he turned to Rachel, this stranger who was his daughter, a woman he had never held, never known, never had the opportunity to disappoint. "I don't know what to say to you. You're my daughter, and I've missed everything. Your first steps, your graduations, your whole life." His voice shattered on the final phrase. "That's a regret I'll carry until the day I die." Rachel was crying too. We all were by then, but her voice remained steady. "We can start now, if you're willing to actually be a father instead of a judge." Gerald nodded, words failing him. My grandmother stepped forward and pressed a tissue into his hand. "Clean yourself up, Gerald. You have a great deal of work ahead." 1 week after the engagement party, I drove to Springfield, Massachusetts. The house was a modest colonial in a peaceful suburb. White siding, blue shutters, a garden of wildflowers tended with obvious care. A far cry from my grandmother's grand estate or Gerald's imposing tutor, yet it radiated a warmth those larger homes had never achieved. Linda Morrison opened the door before my knuckles could touch the wood. She was 56, blonde hair threaded with silver, blue eyes that were an exact reflection of mine. Looking at her felt like gazing into a mirror across 3 decades. "Tori," her voice caught on my name. "I've been staring at your picture all week. I kept thinking I must be dreaming." She drew me into an embrace that smelled of lavender and something undefinable, something that felt, impossibly, like home. We sat at her kitchen table for 4 hours. She showed me photographs, her own childhood, my biological grandparents who had passed years earlier, the life I might have lived if a trainee nurse hadn't made a single catastrophic mistake. She spoke of her late ex-husband, David, my biological father, who had died of cancer 3 years before, never suspecting Rachel wasn't his. "He used to joke that Rachel had old soul eyes," Linda said, dabbing of tears with a kitchen towel. "Now I understand. They were your eyes. They were always your eyes."
I showed her pictures of my own childhood too. The blonde baby in a sea of brunettes, the girl who never quite belonged, the woman who had finally discovered why. "I don't want to replace Diane," Linda said quietly. "She raised you. She's your mother." "She is," I agreed, "but maybe there's room for one more." Linda's smile could illuminate the entire house. "I'd like that. I'd like that very much." 2 months later, I married Nathan Miller in the rose garden of Whitmore Estate, surrounded by fairy lights and family, both into which I was born and the one that raised me. My mother walked me down the aisle. Not Gerald, my mother. She wore a champagne.
"This wedding is not merely the union of two people," Eleanor declared, lifting her champagne flute high. "It is the reunion of two families finally returning to the truth. It honors a daughter who refused to live inside a lie and a mother who waited 28 years to be believed." She looked at me, then at Rachel, then at Diane. "To truth," she said, "however long it takes to arrive." "To truth," the room answered in a quiet, fervent chorus. I drank to that. The lawsuit unfolded over 8 months. Rachel and I filed jointly against St. Mary's Hospital, represented by a medical malpractice attorney my grandmother had located, a formidable woman who specialized in wrongful birth cases and who confessed, with a wry smile, that she harbored a particular disdain for institutions that believe they can bury their errors forever. Margaret Sullivan took the stand, her notarized affidavit supported by the original shift log she had guarded for 28 years. The hospital's attorneys attempted to undermine her, questioning her age, her NDA, the timing of her disclosure. Their efforts collapsed. During discovery, internal documents emerged, emails exchanged among administrators discussing the incident, memos on risk management, even a reoccurring budget entry labeled potential liability settlement that had been quietly renewed every year since 1997. They had known. They had always known, and they had spent nearly 3 decades hoping no one would ever uncover the secret. In the end, the hospital elected to settle rather than risk a jury. $450,000 to each family, $900,000 total, along with a public apology published in the local newspaper, mandatory revisions to their newborn identification procedures, and the public naming and symbolic resignation of the long-retired administrator who had orchestrated the cover-up. "We didn't sue for vengeance," I told the reporter who met us on the courthouse steps. "We sued so no other family would ever spend 28 years living a deception that a hospital could have corrected in a single afternoon." Margaret Sullivan received full immunity from personal liability in return for her cooperation. Afterward, she sent me a simple card, her handwriting still unsteady but resolute. "Thank you for giving me a reason to finally speak the truth. I can sleep now." I keep it in the same drawer as my birth certificate, the real one, the one that reads 11:58 p.m., the one that finally tells the truth. 6 months after the wedding, Gerald invited me to dinner, just the two of us. He chose a modest Italian restaurant in downtown Hartford, not the country club, nothing ostentatious, only a quiet corner booth with red and white checkered cloths, flickering candles, and shelves of dusty wine bottles. He looked older than he had at the engagement party, grayer somehow, smaller, as though the weight of his public confession had physically compressed him. "I wanted to thank you," he said, once we had ordered, "for agreeing to meet me. You're not my biological father, you never were, but you did raise me, even if you did it poorly." He winced, but he nodded. "I'm in therapy now," Diane insisted, strongly suggested anyway, a faint, rueful smile. "We're in couples counseling too. We've been separated, but we're trying to..." He searched for the right phrase. "We're trying to discover whether anything remains worth saving."
I thought of my mother standing before him at the party, demanding the apology she had earned over decades, summoning the courage to even consider rebuilding after everything he had inflicted. I remember when you taught me to ride a bike. I was 5. Before you decided I wasn't yours, you held the seat and ran beside me for an hour until I finally balanced. Gerald's eyes glistened. I remember, he whispered. That's the father I needed, the one who held on. I'm willing to try, Gerald, but understand this. Forgiveness is a process, not a single moment, and you have a tremendous amount of work ahead. He nodded slowly. I know, and I'll do it, however long it takes. I didn't forgive him that night. I'm not certain I have fully forgiven him even now, but I chose to extend the opportunity my mother had never been granted, the chance to demonstrate that change is possible. Rachel and Marcus met properly for the first time at a family dinner a month after the wedding. The air was thick with awkwardness at first. How do you exchange pleasantries with the sibling you should have grown up beside, the brother who received the childhood that might have been yours? Then Marcus mentioned his shellfish allergy. Wait, me too, since birth. The doctor said it was genetic. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Left-handed? Rachel lifted her left hand. No way. Marcus laughed, a genuine, startled, delighted sound. What about music? Favorite bands? 30 minutes later, they had discovered they both adored the same obscure indie folk group no one else in either family had ever heard of. Both despised cilantro with inexplicable fervor. Both tapped their right foot when deep in thought. This is so strange, Marcus said, shaking his head. You're like a mirror, but, the girl version. I was going to say shorter, Rachel replied, tossing a bread roll at him. For the first time in my memory, a Townsend family dinner rang with real laughter, not the polite, carefully manufactured variety my mother had always labored to sustain, but the unguarded, joyful sound of people genuinely glad to be in one another's company. It was a small moment. It felt like the beginning of something enduring. 3 months after the wedding, Diane and Linda met for lunch. I wasn't present, but my mother recounted it later, her voice hushed with quiet awe. They chose a cafe halfway between their homes, neutral territory, just as Rachel and I had done. Linda brought photographs of Rachel's childhood. Diane brought photographs of mine. We lost 28 years, Diane said softly, but we gained each other, and we gained the truth. That has to matter. Linda and Diane now meet for lunch once a month. What began as an unlikely bridge built across shared grief and startling discovery has quietly deepened into genuine friendship. They refer to each other, with gentle humor, as the other mother. In an unexpected way, I believe the connection has helped both women mend parts of themselves that had long remained fractured. I'm sitting in our new apartment now, a bright 2-bedroom in a quieter, lovelier corner of Hartford, with enough space for Nathan's home office and soon the nursery we'll need. The walls hold photographs that tell the story of the past year. My wedding day, my mother on one side of me and Linda Morrison on the other. Rachel and me at our first Thanksgiving together, both of us laughing over too much pie. My grandmother Eleanor looking quietly victorious at her birthday celebration last month. Nathan is in the kitchen, attempting something elaborate with far too many ingredients. He's been on a cooking spree lately, determined to master recipes that require more patience than skill. I've been reflecting on the year behind us, on identity, on family, on what belonging truly means. For 28 years, I tried desperately to prove I was a Townsend. I ironed my blonde hair straight and dark. I learned to golf because Gerald loved the game. I chose nursing over art because it felt safe, dependable, not the kind of pursuit a cuckoo's egg would chase. My entire life was spent trying to squeeze into a shape that was never designed for me. Now I understand I was never meant to fit. I was someone else's daughter, living someone else's life, carrying someone else's lineage. Yet here is what I've come to know. DNA does not define family. The woman who held my hand through nightmares, who taught me to read with flashlight under the covers, who remained married to a man who tormented her simply to preserve our home. That is my mother. Not biology. Love. Nathan emerges from the kitchen carrying 2 plates and a soft, knowing smile. "You're doing that thing again," he says, the deep staring into nothing thing. I laugh and accept the plate he offers. On the coffee table, nestled between stacks of baby name books and a half-filled pregnancy journal, rests the test I took this morning. Positive. I don't know whose genetic echoes this child will carry. Mine, Nathan's, some quiet trace of the Morrisons or the Townsends, but I know one certainty. This baby will be loved from the very first breath, without reservation, without question. That is the only proof that truly counts. If you're watching this and you've ever been accused of something you never did, by a parent, a partner, anyone who should have trusted you, please hear this. The truth has a way of rising. Sometimes it takes 28 years. Sometimes it arrives through a DNA test and the courage of a nurse finally unburdening her conscience. But it rises. Don't let anyone's suspicion determine your value. And if you're the one holding the suspicion, pause and ask, is my certainty worth dismantling the people I claim to love? My father spent 28 years convinced my mother had betrayed him, convinced I wasn't his, convinced his cruelty was righteous. He was wrong on every count. Trust is a deliberate choice. Doubt is effortless. But 28 years of doubt can shatter a family. 28 years of trust could have preserved mine. Thank you for listening to my story. If it moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. More stories like this one are in the description below. Until next time, trust the truth, even when it arrives late.